Good evening, everyone, and you're welcome back. This evening, we're going to be talking about the theory of spontaneous generation. It's also called the theory of abiogenesis. Now, this is a very interesting theory, and it's good to understand this theory in the light of science and the origin of life. Now, this is the theory that believes that life originates from non living matter, that life can come from non living cells. It's the exact opposite of the cell theory or the theory of biogenesis. Now, but for this video, we'll be looking at the spontaneous theory of the theory of spontaneous generation, or the theory of abiogenesis. Now, Aristotle, who is a popular scientist and philosopher, was one of the first proponents of this theory. And this theory states, or this theory tries to explain that life can come from non-living matter, that there can be the generation of life from non-living matter. Now, some of the ways through which Aristotle tried to prove that this can be true was that he gave examples such as fishes appearing on the banks of the river Nile in Egypt after a rainstorm, or for an example, if you have a barn, or you have a barn where you keep maybe cereals, millet, sorghum, you can see that after a while mice or rats can just appear in that barn and be eating those cereals. So those kind of examples, or those kind of examples, were the kind of examples that Aristotle gave to try to prove his belief in the theory of spontaneous generation, meaning that life can result from non-living things. Now, another scientist whose name was John Needham also believed in the theory of spontaneous generation, and he also tried to prove this theory of spontaneous generation by carrying out a series of experiments. And in these experiments, one of the experiments that he did to try to prove this theory was that he had a flask where he had meat broth. Broth is liquid culture. So he had meat broth, and then he put some plant materials and some animal materials also into the meat broth, and then he heats the meat broth for a while, and then he covered the meat broth and allowed it to stay for a few days. And after a few days, he noticed that microorganisms were growing within this meat broth. And to him, this was proof that life could be generated from non-living matter, because his argument was that after heating this meat broth, that without opening it to air, he had killed all life that was present within the meat broth. Yet there was the generation of microorganisms from within the meat broth. This was an experiment that was done by John Needham to try to explain the theory of spontaneous generation. But it's important to know that other scientists started to try to disprove this theory of spontaneous generation. One of the first scientists who tried to disprove this theory was an Italian scientist whose name was Francesco Redi. Francesco Redi was one of the people who disproved, or tried to disprove, this theory of abiogenesis, theory of spontaneous generation, where he also had a series of experiments that he took, that he undertook, or that he carried out in order to be able to prove that life can only come from pre-existing life, which is what the cell theory says. Now, in the experiment that was carried out by Francesco Redi, he had 3 glass jars, and then in these 3 glass jars, he put meat broth inside these 3 glass jars. And the first jar he left open, wide open. The second jar he closed with gauze, and the third jar he closed very, very tightly, sealed very, very tightly. Now, after a couple of days, he came back to look at the experiment, and in the jar that was left open, we could see a lot of growth of maggots and microorganisms inside that jar. Now, in the second jar that had gauze covering that jar, there was no growth, and so for the third jar, which was also tightly sealed, there was no growth of microorganisms or maggots. Now, what this was able to prove was that the organisms that what it was able to prove was that air was carrying a lot of microorganisms, and that housefly also was the one who was able to come and perch and lay eggs in this broth. So this was one of the scientists who was able to, or who began to disprove the theory of spontaneous generation. This is the first video on theory of spontaneous generation. We'll do a second video to discuss 2 other scientists who also came and disproved this theory of spontaneous generation. Thank you for listening, and have a good day.